The meeting will please come to order. I want to first ask unanimous consent to declare recess anytime during the hearing if it's necessary. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted. What? Am I hearing this echo? I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. Members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions without objection, so ordered. As a reminder, please keep your microphone muted, which we weren't doing apparently, unless speaking. And should I hear any inadvertent background noise, I'll request that the member please mute their microphone. To insert a document into the record, please have your staff email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. First, let me thank our witnesses for being here today to discuss the federal disaster recovery in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands as the 5-year anniversary of Hurricane Irma and Maria are upon us. Before we start, though, I'd like to recognize and welcome a former colleague of mine and friend, Governor Pierluisi, who is here from Puerto Rico. Thank you so much for being here. If you feel like interjecting anything, you're more than welcome to join us at the table.
Madam Chair and Mr. Ranking Member, I'll just say that I thank the committee for holding this oversight hearing on the status of the recovery and reconstruction of Puerto Rico's infrastructure as a result of both Irma and Maria. And so I look forward to being here for part of the hearing, and I thank as well the Biden Harris administration, Fema in particular, for their support, for the support Puerto Rico is getting in the context of the pending or ongoing reconstruction. So thank you, ma'am.
Thank you for being here. You're always welcome. It's nice to see you.
Likewise.
These hurricanes, Irma and Maria, absolutely devastated Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. They ravaged the island's infrastructure. The electric grids were wiped out. Roads were made impassable. Critical water infrastructure was severely damaged. Schools were just wiped away, and thousands of homes were destroyed. The territory-wide destruction was unprecedented, and it posed major challenges for disaster response and recovery. When Irma and Maria struck, these two islands did not have the necessary funds available to support a major disaster recovery. As we all know, FEMA's recovery model is centered on reimbursement. It's nearly impossible to kickstart a swift and efficient recovery without access to capital within the existing model. So the scale of destruction paired with liquidity constraints created an unprecedented challenge for the islands and FEMA. The people of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands are entitled to the same quality of critical infrastructure available to the mainland. This includes access to transportation, education, health care, reliable electricity, and clean drinking water. So while this recovery poses many difficulties, it's essential that we face the challenges head on and be sure that these facilities are put back in place. A second challenge for the recovery effort was federal underinvestment in the island's public infrastructure prior to the storms. Most public infrastructure already required significant improvements. Consequently, it was quickly determined that FEMA should not use its traditional public assistance authorities to build back to status quo ante. Instead, FEMA, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands agreed to utilize a new authority provided by Section 428 of the Stafford Act. This is known as alternative procedures, and it would allow the territories to build back better and be more resilient in the face of any future storms. It's important to note, however, that to use these alternate procedures, FEMA and the impacted applicant must determine the value of the damage and develop a fixed cost estimate for each project. If the actual cost of the project exceeds the fixed cost estimate, the the applicant is responsible for the cost overruns. It's critical that the estimates are correct from the beginning, and so construction can begin swiftly once project funds are obligated. Challenges posed by continued liquidity constraints in the territories, the global pandemic, and inflation, however, have caused many concerns that it may not be possible to complete these projects at their estimated cost. I hope we can talk about the potential overruns with witnesses today and how we are going to address that challenge. I'm encouraged to hear from the disaster recovery leaders in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands that their relationship with Fema has improved in recent years, and the pace of recovery is increasing. There has been some success in obligating funds for projects, but unfortunately, little reconstruction work has actually begun. We'd like to hear about that as well. Reconstruction marks a new phase of recovery on the islands. I look forward to discussing the challenges and the solutions with the outstanding witnesses we have here today, so that we can ensure that the future of these recoveries faces fewer roadblocks down in the future, fewer roadblocks than they had in the past. I'm committed to remaining an active partner in this recovery until the very last repair project is completed, and I expect FEMA to commit to us to doing the same. The people of Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands have displayed incredible resilience for the past 5 years, and patience, I might add. So I thank our witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to discussing lessons learned and how we can improve the process, not just for these two areas, but any place in the future where something similar might occur. With that, I'd like to ask our ranking member for his opening statement, Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. It's been 5 years since the hurricanes, Maria and Irma, hit Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today on what the recovery process has looked like, what successes and challenges they have faced, and lessons learned that we would be able to apply across disaster recovery efforts. This is a unique opportunity to examine how our efforts to cut red tape and streamline processes have been implemented by FEMA. Time is money. The longer it takes for communities to rebuild, the higher the cost both to the communities and to the taxpayer. At times, it seems like Congress removes red tape, more red tape kind of appears. And FEMA is kind of the perpetrator of that. We simply can't afford to continue doing things the way we've done it before and expect some kind of different results. For example, in the Sandy Recovery Improvement Act, we created Section 428, a choice for a streamlined, faster process, or to use the old paperwork-intensive process for rebuilding the infrastructure. The 428 authority was intended to speed up the process by basing assistance on certified cost estimates. The idea was to reduce costs by shortening the rebuilding time and cutting administrative costs and arriving faster at a more definitive dollar amount for project. Yet, by many accounts, the 428 process is looking more like the old, cumbersome process, removing any incentives to use it. The 428 Authority and similar reforms have been key tools in the recovery efforts in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Understanding how these reforms are working or not working will help us know what action to take. A complicated recovery process not only hurts communities hit by the disaster, it also increases costs to the taxpayers, especially given the impact of high inflation rates that are now having the cost of the materials and labor. I look forward to hearing the testimony from the witness today, and thank you, Chair, for allowing this hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. We'll now turn to our witnesses. We'll be hearing testimony from 2 panels today. Each panel will be followed by questions from the members. I'd now like to welcome the witness on our first panel, This is Ann Bink, who is the Associate Administrator for the Office of Response and Recovery at FEMA. We thank you for joining us today. We all look forward to hearing your testimony. Without objection, our witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. Since your written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee requests that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. Ms. Bink, welcome, and please proceed.
Thank you. Chair Titus, Ranking Member Webster, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify about FEMA's support of the recovery of Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands from Hurricanes Irma and Maria. As you've stated, in less than 2 weeks, in September 2017, the islands were devastated. Lives were lost, homes were destroyed, the power grid and water systems collapsed, healthcare facilities shut down, and communities were uprooted. Hurricane Maria was the strongest storm to hit St. Croix in Puerto Rico in nearly a century. There were critical immediate needs, and beyond those needs lay a difficult road to recovery. FEMA and the Biden-Harris administration continued recovery efforts from these storms is a top priority, and the agency's investment of resources, and with the generous support of Congress, has been reflective of this commitment. A few weeks ago, Puerto Rico reached the milestone of 10,000 obligated public assistance projects, a total investment of nearly $28 billion. This includes the largest ever public infrastructure project obligated by FEMA at nearly $9.5 billion for the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, or PREPA, which will rebuild the power grid and build it back better. We have also provided $1.5 billion in assistance to nearly 500,000 residents. In the U.S. Virgin Islands, FEMA is making similarly historic investments in public infrastructure. FEMA has obligated over $4 billion across 1,400 projects, and this includes $1.4 billion to restore the energy grid, nearly $1 billion for housing, and $134 million for transportation. FEMA continues to work with the USVI to reach an agreement on project scopes and expects infrastructure assistance to total $12 billion. This investment will result in significantly modernized public health and education sectors and completely rebuild, in a more resilient fashion, large portions of the power, water, and wastewater systems. 5 years after the hurricanes, over 1,000 FEMA employees remain on ground and dedicated to these recovery missions, over 90% of whom are local hires. Notwithstanding this historic commitment, much work remains to be done. This work will lead to a more resilient and better community infrastructure. For example, the Roberto Clemente Stadium in the municipality of Carolina in Puerto Rico. More than a landmark, the baseball stadium plays an important role in the municipality's economy. It impacts local business owners and other sectors like transportation, tourism, and hospitality. This project is nearly complete with the help of over $18.4 million in FEMA funds. In the USVI, FEMA is focused on supporting the vision to transform its infrastructure to better withstand future storms. Recently, FEMA approved over $200 million to replace the now demolished Arthur Richards School. This new school will help ensure students can attend a state-of-the-art facility that is more resilient to future storms. More than $463 million has been obligated to support healthcare facilities, including the Charles Harwood Medical Clinic and the Roy Lester Schneider Hospital. We are also providing historic levels of mitigation assistance, which will greatly enhance resiliency further in the future. Puerto Rico has access to roughly $3 billion in hazard mitigation grant program funding, which is the maximum authorized by the Stafford Act, and the U.S. Virgin Islands has access to roughly $960 million. FEMA is ensuring we are prepared to support residents and communities of the Caribbean. At this very moment, we have responders on the ground and commodities pre-positioned in anticipation of Tropical Storm Fiona. Compared to 2017, we now have 9 times the water, 10 times the meals, and 3 times the number of generators on island. Consistent with the goals of FEMA's strategic plan, we are ensuring equity, resilience, and readiness are at the heart of all we do. We are committed to supporting preparedness and resilient recovery, and we are doing so through on-the-ground technical assistance with our local hires who bring invaluable knowledge of the communities they serve. We also continue to implement policies to advance our strategic plan. One such example is around equitable policy changes. Many homeowners and renters in the past lacked the paperwork required to qualify for some FEMA benefits in the past. Under Administrator Criswell's leadership, FEMA has expanded the types of ownership and occupancy documentation that we can accept to include self-certification as a last resort. Since implementing this policy, more than 100,000 individuals received assistance that would have otherwise been denied. All our efforts have to be balanced against dual imperatives, ensuring that our assistance is provided as quickly as possible and ensuring that these resources benefit the people in the communities that need them most. The governments of Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands have made great progress in their ability to manage historic levels of federal funding and advance recovery for their residents. In closing, when I began leading the Office of Response and Recovery, one of my very first field visits was to Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, where I observed firsthand the achievements of our team on the ground, as well as the challenges that lie ahead. Last fall, FEMA participated in a recovery summit with USVI officials, which provided valuable outcomes. And we're going to continue to build on that as we will host our second annual USVI Recovery Summit in the fall. Similarly, just last month, I also spent a week at a summit with Puerto Rico's top recovery officials and our senior leadership team, where we continue to work towards solutions to advance our collective recovery efforts. We are firmly committed to an expedited recovery to enhance resilience against all future hazards. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. We'll now move on to the members' questions. Each member will be recognized for 5 minutes, and I'll start by recognizing myself. Thank you for that testimony. I'd like to go back to something I mentioned in the opening statement, and that's the concern about cost increases, whether it's due to inflation or the pandemic or the problems with having the funds in the islands. Can you address what those problems are and tell us how the projects that are under that alternative procedure and FAST will be able to continue if they don't have the money and if the estimates aren't adequate to reach the current costs?
Absolutely. I appreciate the question and share the concerns you raised. We are in a dynamic environment, and one of the reasons alternate procedures was a valuable approach is because we built in not only inflationary cost increases into estimates, but also a future price factor, which was designed specifically and only for Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands under the BBA authority that was provided to us. And that really has resulted in estimates that we believe will meet the needs of the recovery scope going forward. There is flexibility within those 4 to 8 projects, as we call them, that to balance underruns with overruns should different estimates and bids come in at different levels. But we are mindful of that, and we continue to address the challenges we see in the broader landscape. One example is around supply chain. We have worked with the Puerto Rico's government on a project, which this is the first time we've done this, where we have developed a project of $650 million to support equipment and supplies that have longer lead times, so that when shovels are ready to go into the ground, that equipment is available to support the grid build back and resilience efforts. So that's a $650 million project we've worked with Puerto Rico to obligate. That's just one example, but we will continue to monitor the landscape, and if conditions reveal needs that we have not yet addressed, we will work to address those within our authorities.
So you think there's some alternative to just not appropriating the money or forcing the local governments to have to make up the difference?
That's right, and we'll closely monitor the progress as we move forward. The things like developing projects for those longer lead time materials and equipment is a big step forward because the best defense against inflationary increases and other supply chain disruptions is to get those shovels in the ground. And we have seen tremendous progress in that regard, as I'm sure you'll hear more about from Puerto Rico officials, recovery officials, 2,200 projects in construction now and about 1,000 complete. That's excellent progress, and we're looking forward to building upon that with our close relationship of our teams on the ground.
Appreciate that. I wonder if you can tell us why it's taken so long, what your insights are. And in the last Congress, your predecessor was asked if FEMA was a long-term agency or short-term. And he said, well, I'd make the case that we're a response agency and short-term. Well, I don't know, is 5 years short-term or long-term? Is it the glass half empty or half full? I wonder if FEMA is committed to the long-term recovery.
Chair Titus, I sit before you today confirming our commitment to the long-term recovery of Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Since the storm hit, we have not left. We still have over 1,000 FEMA employees, many of which are survivors from the storms themselves, that remain on the island and committed to the recovery and resilience of the islands. It's our -- 1 priority, and I stand behind it.
Would you address why it's taken so long?
Absolutely. Yes. There's no doubt that starting with a new process under the BBA and developing projects that are of such significance and magnitude, given the scope of the damage, created challenges. We did, through the authorities granted through the BBA, were able to obligate in historic short timeframes a large magnitude of funding for Puerto Rico. And that was not without its challenges, given how new it was. That was also through an earthquake, COVID-19 disruptions, and the fact that when you look, if you take the power sector in Puerto Rico as an object lesson, over 80% of the transmission and distribution network was damaged or destroyed from Maria. That is a large volume and a very concentrated level of damage that had been unprecedented. So yes, there were challenges. I believe we're in a position now to really hit the gas and keep moving and getting those shovels in the ground to progress the recovery of the islands.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Associate Administrator Bink. A goal of disaster funding is to help states rebuild the infrastructure following a disaster. Recognizing the benefits to taxpayer of mitigation, Congress authorized funding to ensure states could build in mitigation as they rebuild existing infrastructure. However, mitigation is different than funding completely new duplicative infrastructure. For example, I understand that despite the U.S. Virgin Islands' existing liquid propane gas system, FEMA may be pushing for USVI to transition to solar in rebuilding. What is FEMA's role and policies on funding new systems rather than fixing the ones that exist?
Ranking Member, thank you very much for the question. Our role is as an enabler. If when FEMA's doing our job, we are doing the job of ensuring that the goals of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands and all of our recipients across the board are meeting their objectives. We are there to support their projects and their resilience efforts to meet the goals that they have in the future and ensure that their spending is in alignment with all of our program requirements so they can maintain that funding and maintain that progress. So we are agnostic to the goals themselves. We support those goals as the recipients move toward more resiliency and a speedy recovery.
So the idea of heading out in the direction of rebuilding the existing infrastructure, is that something that can be totally modified?
I'm happy to look into the specifics of the projects you're speaking of, and I can work with my team and yours to get more detail on the specifics there to work on that.
Okay. So funding also from other agencies like HUD have also been provided for these recovery efforts. However, there are concerns that FEMA's process is not streamlined in a way that would maximize the efficient use of these funds. For example, FEMA requires that HUD funding that may be used to support the state's cost share must be accounted for by project other than a faster approach of combining calculations across multiple projects. Is this the case, or if so, why is FEMA requiring this?
The complexity is certainly an issue that, as a New York State recovery official, I had experienced related to multiple funding streams. And in this role, it is a priority of mine to ensure that we are reducing complexity wherever we can. One example is related to implementing a flexible match concept within each of those 428 projects. We've worked with Puerto Rico to, within those large infrastructure projects, like the $9.5 billion PREPA project, working to provide a flexible structure so that part of the work needs to meet not only FEMA requirements, but also HUD requirements, which, as you pointed out, can differ. That flexibility will streamline the process and save valuable time as Puerto Rico continues its recovery. It's something we've also discussed with the U.S. Virgin Islands, and will continue to work to streamline and simplify the application of multiple funding streams as they apply to FEMA projects.
So the idea of working together is not anathema, it's you're using it. Okay.
Yeah, and absolutely. And as part of the summit with USVI, I just discussed with the Office of Disaster Recovery potentially bringing in HUD too, so we can have those critical discussions at the leadership level and make sure we're all leveraging all flexibilities within our authorities to the maximum extent.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Go
you.
back.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. Now, Ms. Holmes Norton.
Thank you, Chairwoman Titus. Associate Administrator Bink, the U.S. Virgin Islands Office of Disaster Recovery reports that FEMA's building cost index estimates the high cost of construction in the Virgin Islands and could lead the long-term construction projects without adequate funding. How does FEMA account for inflation and supply chain challenges when calculating construction costs for years long?
Thank you for the question. There are multiple ways in which we address the inflationary factors and supply chain concerns as we move forward. And when project estimates are developed for alternative projects, not only the future price factor, which is unique to the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, where we're really looking at the future needs when it comes to funding to support the work under those projects as time elapses. There's also inflationary factors that are built in to those projects. Beyond that, once the values are set, funding can be redistributed within each of those larger alternative projects for underruns and overruns as bids are put out and those numbers come back. So there are many factors and many flexibilities within the 428 structure that address supply chain and future inflationary costs concerns.
Well, in light of the Office of Disaster Recovery's concerns, will FEMA undertake a review of the cost estimate models in the building cost index?
So we're certainly looking at our building cost index modeling, and we know there's challenges there. I've just spoken with the Office of Disaster Recovery about it this morning. We will continue those discussions, and we will continue to monitor the impacts of inflationary factors and supply chain considerations in the future as bids do come in for construction and shovels start to hit the ground.
FEMA's accelerated awards strategy expedites obligations by aggregating awards for individual projects to be completed by a local governmental agency into one overall, what it calls recovery budget. However, the individual projects apparently still need to be approved by FEMA. What steps will FEMA take to expedite the approval process for individual projects?
So that's a great question, and it's squarely within the scope of the review we're doing of the Consolidated Resource Center 5-year review right now. We've taken a deep dive into our process. It's been about 5 years since it's been implemented. And we're looking at things we can improve and things we can streamline to ensure that when project scopes are submitted, that they are quickly reviewed and adjudicated so that the work can begin. Again, we know the best defense against inflation, supply chain concerns, is really to get to that construction point. And that is our laser focus, and that's the support we're providing on the ground through our joint recovery offices, and it's what we'll do centrally through CRC improvements.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bink, and I yield back.
Thank you. We'll now go to someone who's very much involved in this issue, who brings it up at every hearing, and who has done a great job of informing us and staying on top of it, Ms. Gonzalez-Colon.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to say thank you to you and the ranking member for actually having this hearing and allowing Puerto Rico to have so many witnesses in the two panels we have today. I think it's important. We're just reaching to the 5-year anniversary, and there are many questions still in the air about that recovery process. Having said that, I also want to say that FEMA has done a great job during the last years trying to expedite. There's still a lot of things to do, and that's the reason I think this hearing is so important, seeing where are those areas that we need some improvement. Because in one side, I know local agencies are submitting the documents, and sometimes they're waiting for too long to get approved or having another second thought. So in that sense, it's been 5 years, I think, but it could have been yesterday as well. And the hit of that Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands took was historic and life-changing for many of us. Whole lifetimes of work, even the pride of 80 years of progress just went shut down in a night. Over 3 million left without power, communications, transportation, but the people of Puerto Rico did not fall apart. And I think that's the great message that we came together just to survive. In that sense, we have extended the lack of essential services meant thousands of excess deaths in Puerto Rico. And my colleagues, and I need to say, they came with me to the island and responded with funding for recovery. A lot of members, I will say more than 100 members of Congress came together and traveled to Puerto Rico alongside with cabinet officials to make all the funding that was approved. And staff from FEMA and other agencies have been working hard from the start, but has been too slow to see some effects. And in that sense, major obligation for permanent infrastructure rebuilding really began only late 2020. My constituents are frustrated with the lack of progress, and the biggest symbol is the continued instability of the electrical grid. They hear about over $4 billion approved for repairs of damage, or almost $10 billion obligated for permanent rebuilding, but they are still getting frequent interruptions, plant going offline, substations on fire, lines failing. And that's the reality we face in Puerto Rico right now. Today, with a tropical storm approaching, the social networks are filling with anxiety about again being months without power, and that's the reality Puerto Ricans are living. So the people ask, where is all the aid that is being approved by Congress? What has been done or is being done? And when people will see the results, at least in the electric grid. I hope we can get some of those answers today. And there's much more to be done, apply lessons learned, and to commit to doing better going forward. But we're here today to listen, and I got some questions to you. And one of them, Administrator Bink, is of the $9.5 billion obligated for long-term power grid recovery in Puerto Rico, how much has been applied for?
So right now with the $9.5 billion, we are seeing significant, we have over 40 projects that have been approved in scopes of work. That work is continuing at rapid.
But how many of the $9.5 billion are being applied for?
So the $9.5 billion will be completely utilized at the end, meaning that the $9.5 billion is the amount, and this is what makes the 428 program so valuable for the island. And this, again, is the largest infrastructure project ever obligated by FEMA, which makes this a once in a lifetime opportunity.
But my question, Administrator, I know the money's going to be used.
Yep.
But my question, right now, how much of the money is being applied for even by PREPA, by LUMA, or whoever is going to be managing the electrical grid. You just told me that you just approved 40 of those projects. So what's the percentage of share of the whole $9.5 billion?
So what I can do is provide you the detail after. I don't have the specific numbers right
Okay,
off the top of
perfect.
my
I
head.
prefer you to give me the specifics.
Absolutely. And Core 3 and PREPA and LUMA will have the specifics on the projects. But what I can say
Yeah,
is.
but that's going to be the second panel. I want FEMA to give me the numbers of what you've been approved, what has been submitted, applied, and approved by FEMA, and how much has been dispersed. What is the expected number for now? You don't have that number right now.
So, well, the key that I wanted to raise was that the $9.5 billion will be the amount spent by Puerto Rico. That number will be the ultimate spending, because any funds that are not used to support
I know,
rebuild will be supporting
I know,
resilience.
but that's not the question I made.
Yep.
So if you can provide, I know my
I
time
could
expired. If you can provide us how much has been applied, how much has been approved, how many projects, and what is the percentage of share of those $9.5 billion?
Absolutely.
I yield back. Well, I can continue. Thank you. How many of those electrical grid projects have been applied and approved from all sources? Because we're talking here about fast, but there are also regular disbursement, and I would love to know how much will be the total of that amount between the federal programs that are being approved for just electrical grid. I'm not going into the municipalities, just for the electrical grid.
So overall, for public utilities, for Maria, the number of amount obligated is $13.2 billion, 265 projects overall. So that's where a lot of the scopes, including that largest project ever, will be specified, scoped out, and then the shovels will continue to hit the ground. So that is the overall scope of all public utility projects.
We knew that. I mean, we were the ones who approved the funding. So my question again is, sometimes agencies of the islands claim that FEMA is being slow approving the projects that have been submitted. So I have you here, and that's the reason I'm making the question of how much has been applied for. That's one thing. How much has been obligated, how much has been disbursed, and separating the accounts that money is coming from. You know, FAST is one thing, and the other one was the regular disaster funds. So knowing that, who is responsible for applying and certifying those projects, and who's responsible for receiving and accounting for it? It's FEMA, it's going to be Core 3, it's going to be LUMA, it's going to be PREPA.
So that's part of what we're doing on the ground. So we obligate the funding, and the recipient in this case would be the Puerto Rico government, determines the scopes within those larger projects, and then submits those scopes of work for approval from FEMA. That's typically our
We're talking
role.
about electrical grid. We're not talking about the rest of the
All
projects.
projects, all projects. And if there's subrecipients, they would move through the recipient, which is Core 3 in this case, with Mr. LeBoy serving as the governor's authorized representative. So at that point, we review those scopes, we approve, and then the bids and the construction proceeds.
How much has been disbursed right now for electrical grid purposes?
So for public utilities, low amount has been dispersed, about 40 million at this point, but again,
40 million.
that's against the overall public utility Category F spending. But again, there's a lot of detail that goes into that and a lot of work happening to develop those scopes of work. It's the focus of what we're doing with our technical support on the island, which again, goes beyond what we typically do for disaster recovery development of projects.
I'm not questioning that. I'm just saying that $40 million that is been disbursed for electrical grid has been 5 years. And I know a lot of the equipment that is going to be purchased are not, over the counter in a store that you just grab them and put it in the electrical grid. I know many of those scope of work need plans, either from LUMA, either for PREPA. My concern, and the numbers I would love you to provide to this committee, is how much is being applied specifically. I know the government of Puerto Rico and the governor, who I recognize is here, has been very eager in working together with the Department of Energy to what intent the money is going to be used. If it's for renewables, it's going to be transmission, it's going to be the plants, it's going to be illumination. But our concern, people of the island, is how many of those funds are being applied, obligated, dispersed? And in that plan of scope that you were just mentioning, how many projects are in the pipeline? Because if we are going to be waiting 5 more years to get that money done, then the inflation is another big area that we need to tackle, because many of those projects that may be projected today are going to be without resources. And I want to say thank you, Madam Chair, for providing me with extra time.
Well, maybe Ms. Bink can get together with you afterwards or something and to help you with some of those numbers.
We're happy to provide that. I do want to say one other thing, though. In our role and our coordination with the Department of Energy and the Puerto Rican government, we are in lockstep in working toward the PR 100 goals in the 2050 plan for renewable energy, getting to that 100% by 2050. That takes time, and that can take work. And that's where you see, while the start could have been faster, we're starting to see that pivot toward more work, more shovels in the ground, and really that work to develop the resilience infrastructure in the island is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And while it takes time to get there, we think it's time well spent, because the island will be more resilient, more independent from an energy perspective going forward.
Thank you. You know, I've heard you mention several times shovel-ready, but I've learned over the years from engineers that you really have to be pencil-ready. And so I'm sure a lot of what you're working on has involved pretty elaborate pencil-ready projects before you get to the shovels. And aren't you engaged with, as FEMA, with that stage of the process too?
We're really engaged in all steps. Having joint recovery offices on site, on island, that's an extra step in our technical assistance that you don't typically see. The other thing we're consistently doing is looking for opportunities to expand our technical assistance within the authorities granted, or in some cases moving beyond that, requesting additional authorities. Just last week, we did submit a proposed legislation that would offer further technical assistance to the U.S. Virgin Islands. That would address supply chain concerns potentially, provide additional support to the USVI to achieve their long-term goals, and we'll bring more detail on that to the committees and the relevant committees as we move forward. But you know, we're always thinking about what can we do on the ground to move these projects forward into completion, and what can we do to build in resilience in every opportunity we have.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Garcia, recognize you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for having this hearing, most important hearing. To Ms. Bink, we've received important concerns from local groups in Puerto Rico about how the reconstruction of the electrical grid and other projects funded with public assistance funds are not complying with climate policies promoted by this administration, specifically in the Puerto Rican government 10-year plan for reconstruction of the grid. 2 methane gas and other carbon emitting projects are proposed, and there's no mention of renewable energy projects such as rooftop solar microgrids. Nevertheless, FEMA has issued an environmental finding of no significant impact decision on this 10-year plan, stating that the environmental impact of projects is to be seen in a case-by-case basis. Thus, my first question, can you explain to us how FEMA is ensuring that federal funds for reconstruction are being used in ways that do not violate federal laws or policies to attend climate change and promote resilient communities?
It's a great question. And what you're seeing right now is the start of the projects and the rebuilding work. The scopes related to resilience take time to develop and are and will be in alignment with the PR 100 goals that we're undertaking jointly with the government of Puerto Rico as well as Department of Energy. So those scopes related to resilience portions of projects take a while. I experienced this in New York State when I was the recovery official working on 428s for Sandy projects, and it's true here. The resilience work will take time, but the goals will align ultimately with those set forth by Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands to meet their needs. We will make sure we enable projects that bring them where they want to be.
So you don't see any violation of laws or policies that have been championed by the administration?
So I'm not familiar with the specifics there. I can certainly go back to my team and provide further detail,
Okay.
but
Thank
not to
you.
my knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you. My next question, what are the processes to evaluate the projects proposed by the government of Puerto Rico as to their climate sustainability?
So we're an enabler in the sense that we want to ensure that the projects that the government bring forth to us to implement are aligned with FEMA requirements and standards, and that their goals for resiliency are met on their terms. What they're looking to do, how they're looking to do it, and ensuring that all our rules, policies, and laws are followed in the process. So we are there to enable their recovery on their terms.
And my last question, what affirmative steps have been made or taken to make sure that funds are not wasted or misused in a building back a fossil fuel infrastructure that is outdated and goes against the logic of building back better?
Well, one of the key capacity builders in the grid is ensuring that it can take on renewable energy sources and drive those long-term resilient actions. So as the rebuilding occurs within the grid, it will set the baseline and the ability to then bring in renewable sources of energy and cleaner sources of energy, which is part of the plan, as I understand it, from Puerto Rico recovery officials.
Thank you for that. No further questions, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. That concludes our first panel. We thank you, Ms. Bink, for providing us with information, and we would ask you to get back to the members who had questions that you said you could get additional information from. So thank you very much. We now call up panel 2. There seem to be a lot of questions about the electric grid. I think some of these members of this panel may be able to address those.
Incoming tropical storm to Puerto Rico, so she's got to go get at the ready.
It was pointed out to me that Ms. Bink has to leave to go back to get ready for the tropical storm that is coming to Puerto Rico. It seems kind of like poetic. Thank you all very much for being here. We have Chris Curry, who is the Director of Office of Homeland Security and Justice with the Government Accountability Office. We have Adrian Williams, who is the Director of the Office of Disaster Recovery for the U.S. Virgin Islands. And I would point out that we have talked to Stacy Plaskett. She is very concerned about this for her input into some of these questions. So thank you for being here. Manuel Laboy, who is the Executive Director for the Office of Recovery and Reconstruction and Resiliency in Puerto Rico. Shay Bamirad, who is the Senior Vice President from Luma Energy. And then Josue Colon, who is the Executive Director of the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority. So we thank you, and we look forward to hearing your testimony. Without objection, our witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. And so for that reason, we would ask that you keep your oral testimony to 5 minutes. So we'll start with you, Mr. Curry. You may proceed.
Thank you, Chair Titus, Ranking Member Webster, other members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about all of our work that we've done over the last 5 years on the recoveries in Puerto Rico and the USVI. And I just want to say I think it's great that you have both places represented here today because the challenges in the Virgin Islands are no less severe than are in Puerto Rico too. So the recoveries from these disasters are definitely the most complicated and likely most expensive in the country's history, and not just because of the scale of the damage, but also the complexity of the situation in both places financially. Most members on this committee have had disasters in your jurisdictions, and you know what it's like to manage these programs. Federal programs can be very complicated, lengthy, and very frustrating to navigate, even for the most routine disasters, and especially for large, complicated ones. I want to be clear that in my view, the recovery in both places is not where it needs to be and is not moving as fast as it should be. The best way I can talk about this is through numbers. Most of the federal dollars actually spent so far are for earlier response and emergency repair work, not permanent repairs. And rebuilding of key infrastructure like schools, hospital buildings, and other things still has a long way to go. You heard in the first panel about obligated dollars. To be clear, obligation, according to FEMA itself, is an agreement to spend money now or in the future. Project obligations are not construction, they're not shovels in the ground. In Puerto Rico, FEMA has obligated over $21 billion for public assistance projects, this permanent work I've talked about. However, only $407 million, that's 2%, has actually been spent. In the VI, they've obligated $2 billion for permanent projects, and they've spent about $617 million. That's a little bit better at 31%, but they still have a long way to go too. The FEMA money is the largest pot, but federal funds and other agencies are delayed too. Congress appropriated about $20 billion for HUD funds to Puerto Rico, and as of last month, $900 million had been spent. That's 4.5%. $1.9 billion was appropriated to VI for HUD, and $215 million is spent. That's 11%. These billions in unspent dollars, as we talk about them, are a huge scope, and they represent thousands of projects. But to make this a little bit more real, my written testimony includes pictures, for example, of a school that we've been to and outside of San Juan several times over the course of several years. That school now looks worse than it did after Hurricane Maria. To me, the photo tells the story of the numerous recovery challenges that we faced. And I think it'd be hard to imagine a school in the suburbs of DC or another large city that was sitting overgrown and dilapidated for 5 years. And I point this out not to blame anyone, but to be clear on the status of the recovery. There are thousands of federal, Commonwealth, and municipal folks working hard on the recovery, and FEMA has also done a number of things to try to address problems and address some of our recommendations. For example, we've found in the past that constantly changing policy and guidance for these projects has led to problems in both locations in estimating costs and delays in agreeing to project scope and obligations. FEMA has worked with both places, both islands, to improve this area and has implemented several steps to streamline these processes. And we've heard during our recent visits, just a couple months ago, that communication and coordination with FEMA in Puerto Rico particularly has been improved. However, while there's been progress, I think we're entering a really difficult phase. This doesn't get easier the further we get into it. Our ongoing work on Puerto Rico has identified a number of challenges, I think many of which are likely to affect the Virgin Islands in the same way or maybe even worse. For example, many municipalities still lack the staff, the experience, and the knowledge of federal procurement rules and policies. And this is really important right now because thousands of contracts, literally thousands, are going to be awarded in the coming years for projects. It's critical because these processes can determine whether these costs are reimbursed by FEMA or not. If they're not followed, oftentimes they won't be reimbursed. There's still also many disagreements about project scopes that can lead to delays in starting them. Inflation, as has been already discussed, is also a huge concern. While some inflation was factored into these projects, like Ms. Bink talked about, that was done 2 to 3 years ago. Nobody could have possibly understood what was going to happen this year with inflation, and I think this is going to have a huge impact on estimated projects as we go. And lastly, I'll just point out, for the sake of time, there are also concerns about the supply chain and needed supplies. This is going to be a key part of this too. And let me just end by saying I think it's important to understand that these federal dollars are not just critical for rebuilding damaged projects. This is critical for the economy of Puerto Rico for the years to come. It's a huge part of their expected GDP, and I think it's very important that we continue to monitor them. Thank you very much.
Ms. Williams?
Good morning, Chairwoman Titus and Ranking Member Webster, members of the committee. I'm Adrienne Williams Octolin, Director of the Office of Disaster Recovery in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Thank you for holding this hearing and for the opportunity to provide testimony on the status of the Virgin Islands recovery 5 years after the devastating storms. Hurricanes Irma and Maria brought a tremendous amount of damage to the Virgin Islands, but also provided opportunity to rebuild an aged infrastructure. While there has been significant progress in advancing the efforts, the territory remains in a fragile state. The accomplishments to date have been achieved despite significant challenges related to federal bureaucratic processes, a global pandemic, which exacerbated the already acknowledged complexity of recovering from back-to-back Category 5 storms. With damages estimated to be over $11 billion, which is nearly 3 times the annual gross domestic product, the territory anticipates receiving $8 to $10 billion from federal programs over the next 5 years to aid in the recovery. To date, $5.6 billion of the anticipated $8 billion has been obligated to the territory. $2.7 billion of those funds have been expended. With a portfolio of only 1,500 projects, at least 783 hurricane recovery projects have been completed to date, and 500 are underway. Progress has not come without its challenges. In requiring the territory to submit reimbursement requests to FEMA for approval before gaining authorization to draw funds, the territory was placed in 2019 under manual draw. This created a significant delay in getting payments out to vendors. In February 2021, FEMA lifted the manual draw requirements for reimbursement spending in the territory. This decision demonstrated FEMA's confidence in the territory's ability to manage its federal recovery dollars. The geographical makeup and fiscal constraints of the territory creates a set of unique circumstances not experienced in any town, USA. In many instances, these challenges have pushed FEMA into uncharted waters and forced the development of innovative approaches to disaster recovery practices. Congress recognized these distinct challenges and in 2018 passed the Bipartisan Budget Act. The BBA allowed for the rebuilding of critical facilities to prevailing industry standards. To date, a total of 92 projects have been requested for replacement through FEMA, 46 of which have been approved to include 17 educational facilities and 8 healthcare facilities. Additionally, FEMA has approved the replacement of the wastewater system and potable water systems for the island of St. Croix, paving the way for similar considerations for St. Thomas and St. John. The benefits of the BBA cannot be underscored enough. It has created the genesis for the transformation of a resilient Virgin Islands. Although the BBA provided tremendous opportunities for the territory, unfortunately, it took FEMA almost a year to release the associated policy guidance to enable the implementation of the laws as Congress intended. These provisions created a complete metamorphosis of how FEMA administers its public assistance program. In its initial stages, the territory had concerns that the FEMA policies were not aligned with Congress's intent. It was not until October 2021, the FEMA US BBA Summit, held with Governor Albert Bryan Jr., Delegate Congress Stacey Plaskett, and of course members of the Appropriations Committee and FEMA leadership, that key policy decisions were made to align more with the intent of Congress. This discussion yielded the obligation of funding for reconstruction of the first school and addressed questions that impacted funding for healthcare facilities. We are, however, still experiencing challenges with the agreement of fixed cost offers. The territory has requested a second summit to address lingering issues related to cost development to ensure that we are maximizing assistance and proper application of the BBA provisions. As you may be aware, the territory is not in a position to provide upfront funding projects. Therefore, it is critical that obligations are in line with actual costs. Many of these projects will be in construction over the next 5 to 7 years. With the cost of inflation, supply chain issues that are currently being experienced, the territory is at great risk for cost overruns for 428 projects. The territory has found it necessary to leverage multiple federal resources for a project to be feasible. The layering of federal funding is very challenging. As agencies become territorial with governing regulations, this inevitably results in contractors including the cost of time and money in bids and has the unintended consequence of driving the cost of the recovery up. The territory continues to advocate for a waiver of the local match requirement. Under the current situation, the USVI is dedicating $500 million of its HUD CDBG-DR funds to cover the non-federal share of the FEMA public assistance projects. This, however, requires the laborious task of having each project reviewed by another federal agency, again, delaying costs to contractors. The request to waive the match is well within the line of the Insular Areas Act. However, multiple requests have been denied by FEMA as recently as June 2022. The territory simply does not have the resources to cover local match requirements, and even with the allocation of the CDBG-DR funds, additional funds may be necessary. Lastly, capacity issues are not limited to the territory. Federal agencies are also experiencing the impact of the lack of experienced personnel to assist with the reviewing of recovery funds. Timelines associated with reviewing projects tend to span months before responses are received. As disasters become more prevalent, it is prudent that we move the complexities so we can get the resources to the people who need them most. The territory is continuing to lead efforts to rebuild a resilient public infrastructure and positively transform our territory for generations to come. I would like to thank Delegate to Congress Stacey Plaskett, the Department of Interior, FEMA, HUD, and all of our local and federal partners for the continued support. On behalf of Governor Albert Bryan Jr. and the people of the Virgin Islands, I would again like to thank you and this body for your support and commitment to the U.S. Virgin Islands recovery and its quest to build a resilient Virgin Islands. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Mr. LaBoy.
Thank you, Chairman Titus, Ranking Member Webster, for the chance to be here today to talk about the status of Puerto Rico's recovery 5 years after Hurricanes Irma and Maria. My name is Manuel LaBoy, and I serve as the Governor's authorized representative and as the Director of the Central Office for Recovery, Reconstruction, and Resiliency for Puerto Rico, also known as CORE 3. My remarks today will first describe the dire circumstances under which Puerto Rico was devastated by back-to-back hurricanes and our efforts in the early years to get our heads above water. Then I'll discuss the last couple of years when Puerto Rico's recovery began to take off and make real progress. When Hurricanes Irma and Maria hit Puerto Rico in September 2017, we were already in crisis. Puerto Rico had just entered bankruptcy, it was illiquid, and had no access to capital markets. Much of Puerto Rico's infrastructure was beyond its useful life and in a state of deterioration. From 2017 until 2020, our recovery was devoted to emergency work and temporary measures. During this phase, FEMA programs and processes went through several major shifts during this time, including institution of a new delivery model, an amendment to the disaster declaration that require the use of fixed cost estimates for large projects, and the implementation of the FEMA Accelerated Award Strategy, known as FAST, designed to expedite the obligation of funding for the energy, water and sewer, and public schools infrastructure. During this period, Puerto Rico also suffered 2 additional major disasters. First, the earthquakes, and then COVID-19. By the end of 2020, $4 billion for emergency work had been disbursed and $13.5 billion for permanent work obligated to repair, restore, and replace damaged facilities by Hurricane Maria. The last 2 years have seen great collaboration with our federal partners, primarily FEMA. We have moved to the recovery forward into the permanent work phase, which requires the development of scopes of work, the design and engineering projects, procurement of construction contracts, and ultimately, construction, while FEMA continues to obligate permanent work funding, reaching a total of $21.4 billion of federal share today. To accelerate the reconstruction, we requested FEMA to take certain actions to remove obstacles, and FEMA has worked with us to do so, including lifting a 2019 agreement that imposed conditions on the island before requests for reimbursements could be granted, and the provision of working capital advances, which have been immensely helpful in allowing us to increase permanent work disbursements and advance the execution of large projects laid by the municipalities, the Puerto Rico Power Authority, and the Puerto Rico Aqueduct and Sewer Authority. In the last 2 years, FEMA and Puerto Rico have achieved so much. Over 5,600 projects are under execution, including 1,700 in the design, engineering, and permitting step, about 2,200 projects in construction phase. Projects include roads and bridges, schools and hospitals, water and sewer, ports, recreational and sports facilities, and power generation and the electrical grid. The latter is fundamental for the integration of renewable energy technology. From 370 permanent work projects completed by the end of 2021, today that number is over 1,100. Equally critical, Puerto Rico has submitted all closeout packages for the Hurricane Irma disaster and over 600 packages for Hurricane Maria, and has continued to undergo FEMA's Validate As You Go process, passing with flying colors. Since 2021, the amount of permanent work disbursed has increased by $543 million compared to $153 million disbursed between 2017 and 2020. In terms of the Hazard Mitigation Grants Program, Core 3 has successfully submitted over $4 billion in application packages to FEMA, including renewable energy and climate adaptation-related projects. Just 2 weeks ago, FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell came to visit Puerto Rico and expressed how pleased she was with the collaboration taking place and the work getting done on the island. It has been a difficult journey, and even though we are tackling recent challenges such as cost increases and availability of skilled labor, Puerto Rico is on the road to recovery and resilience. Since 2017, Core 3 has provided critical technical assistance to all of our subrecipients to obtain funding and to execute work in compliance with federal and state requirements. We deeply appreciate FEMA's full support and recent efforts to simplify its recovery processes and look forward to additional steps it may take to continue increasing administrative efficiencies. We are confident that the momentum gained for advancing the reconstruction will not diminish. On the contrary, will accelerate in 2023 and beyond. Again, we thank you for the opportunity to be here to share this with you today.
Thank you very much, Mr. LeBoy. Now, Ms. Baramirad, will you say it for me?
Good morning. It's Shea Baramirad.
Well, I was pretty close.
Thank you. Titus and Subcommittee Ranking Member Webster and members of the committee. My name is Dr. Shea Baramirad, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Engineering, Asset Management, and Capital Program with Luma Energy and the President-elect of Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, Power and Energy Society. Thank you for the invitation to appear this morning to discuss one of the most important and urgent matters for the people of Puerto Rico, the transformation of Puerto Rico's electric power system. All of us at Luma, the over 3,000 men and women who work very hard every day in rain and shine to repair and rebuild the energy system in Puerto Rico, are determined to overcome the profound operational and infrastructure challenges we inherited from the past utility operator. Our goal is clear. We will, over the coming months and years, build a more reliable, more resilient, and cleaner energy future for the 1.5 million customers we are fortunate to serve. It is important to fully understand the scope of the operational failure that have plagued Puerto Rico and the amazing people who call this beautiful island their home. As we have documented through photographic evidence provided to the committee, the transmission and distribution system LUMA inherited was weakened by years, if not decades, of poor design, little to no maintenance, lack of proper inspection, and other profound failure that continues to impact the overall stability and reliability of the system. The picture we provided to you not only highlight the stark reality we have faced, but they help reinforce the importance of the work that our LUMA teams are undertaking every day to repair, rebuild, and restore the electric grid to a modern level. Since our first day of assuming operation in June of last year, we have implemented an operational approach that is grounded by data, science, and sound engineering, and is aligned with industry standards and best practices. Guided by this approach, our team has done more to move Puerto Rico's energy transformation forward in 15 months than what was accomplished in the past 10 years. Most notably, connecting more than 28,000 customers to solar. That's more solar connection made in a year that was accomplished in prior decade. Improving customer service by, as an example, decreasing average call wait time to approximately 3 minutes versus more than 10 minutes under PREPA. Improving work safety and training procedures for operation, many of which didn't exist prior to LUMA. Replacing over 3,800 failing and broken poles. Replacing over 12,000 streetlights and clearing hazardous vegetation from 100% of substations, and helping reduce the number of outages that an average customer experience in a year by 30%. With respect to moving forward FEMA infrastructure projects, we have initiated 225 projects with FEMA, representing more than $5 billion in federal fund projects. Those include the approval of 29 projects that will address critical infrastructure to reduce outages and increase the reliability and stability of the electric system. We have also started the construction of 14 FEMA projects, including 5 initial streetlight projects with LUMA's $1 billion Community Streetlight Initiative. To put these numbers into context, we have moved forward more FEMA projects in 15 months than what was ever done the last 5 years under the prior operator. Most importantly, it is critical for the community to hear this. Current and future FEMA projects will be guided by science, data, and engineering. They will be built in a manner that is fiscally sound and appropriate oversight that serves the interests of Puerto Rican people and all taxpayers. While we are proud of the progress we have made, there is no doubt that public concerns over operational challenges, such as outage duration, still exist. We have heard those concerns clearly, and we are determined to act. For example, we recently launched the Outage Reduction and Response Initiative to build the progress we have made, reduce the impact of outage duration, and improve our response time when those outages occur. Lastly, given the tragic legacy of Hurricane Maria, LUMA has spent the last year preparing and training to respond to such emergencies. We have worked very closely with FEMA and our other partners and greatly appreciate the support of FEMA and all our agency and government partners. In closing, I would like to thank the committee for the opportunity to be here. To be clear, LUMA is absolutely committed to Puerto Rico's energy future, a better energy future that moves Puerto Rico forward, a better energy future that is more reliable and cleaner, a better energy future that serves the daily needs of people of Puerto Rico. No matter what comes next, all of us at LUMA will not be distracted from this mission. And over the coming months and years, we will build a better energy future that will proudly serve the people of Puerto Rico for generations to come. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Doctor. I hope as an engineer you appreciated my previous comment about pencil ready and not just shovel ready.
Indeed, I did, Congresswoman.
Thank you. Mr. Colon?
Good morning to Chairman DeFazio and Ms. Chairman Titus and Ranking Member Grave and members of the committee, and also to our Congresswoman Gonzalez to allowing me to testify before you today. My name is Josue Colon, and I was appointed as Executive Director of PREPA since September 29 of last year. PREPA is a public power corporation of the government of Puerto Rico and the sole provider of electric power on the island. Our system consists of generation, transmission, and distribution system, including 6 main power plants in 4 locations that generate and transfer baseload power throughout the electrical grid. In addition to this main power plant, PREPA owns and operates simple cycle combustion turbines, as well as hydroelectric stations around the island. Approximately 70% of the power generating capacity of Puerto Rico is located along the southern coast of the island, whereas approximately 50% of the electric power consumption is located in the northeastern coast in the San Juan metropolitan area. PREPA relies on our transmission line that traverse the island, generally running south to north over mountainous terrain to deliver electricity to almost 1 million customers in the San Juan metropolitan area. Therefore, even a small disruption in the transmission line can cause a loss of power to a large segment of the population on Puerto Rico. On the morning of September 20, 2017, 14 days after the passage of Hurricane Irma and before PREPA could finish power restoration work required as a result of that hurricane, Hurricane Maria directly impacted Puerto Rico, causing a total blackout. Emergency power restoration effort after Hurricane Maria lasted more than 1 year. PREPA receives the help and support of federal government, several utilities from mainland, and also contractors. FEMA ultimately awarded more than $1.9 billion in public assistance for emergency work, which PREPA is grateful. When this extreme storm moved across Puerto Rico, PREPA's grid was already vulnerable due to the bankruptcy process that initiated during the summer of 2014. Our fiscal situation was the worst-case scenario under which any electric utility could face 2 Category 5 hurricanes in a period of 2 weeks. After these hurricanes, conditions were further aggravated by the devastating 2020 earthquakes and also by the pandemic of COVID-19. PREPA is now in the permanent reconstruction phase of recovery. Our partnership with FEMA and other federal partners has led to some tremendous progress. In September 2020, FEMA announced the FEMA Accelerated Award Strategy, or FAST, process and guideline, which allows critical infrastructure projects to be grouped together in order to expedite the energy grid work in Puerto Rico. This provides a faster and more flexible process for the application of federal funds needed to increase the reliability and resiliency of Puerto Rico infrastructure. Through FAST, FEMA has obligated over $9.5 billion in public assistance for permanent reconstruction work. This amount representing 90% of the total estimated cost of the permanent work, and is complemented with a cost share of 10% amounting to more than $1 billion that will be covered by local funds from the government of Puerto Rico and CDBG-DR funds. So far, 38 scope of work have been submitted to FEMA for approval, and close to $183 million will be disbursed to PREPA in the near future. This funding will be used to rebuild substation, distribution, and transmission lines, and repair or replace generations assets for suitable and reliable power for the long-term future. In addition to FEMA 428 funds, FEMA obligated approximately $1.5 billion in federal funds under the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, or FEMA 404, for permanent work on the generation and water infrastructure. FEMA's support of PREPA recoveries has been invaluable to our people, but it has not been without challenges. PREPA's path ahead will be focused on ensuring the proper expenditure of its federal grant that will be used to create a modern, reliable, efficient, and resilient energy system. Our goal is to ensure through the partnership with our transmission and distribution system operator that we will build an electric system that can be adequately withstand with any future storm. Such a monumental rebuilding project will take time. We ask that this committee continue to support Puerto Rico and FEMA in this long-term endeavor. PREPA continue to strive for the full obligation and execution of its recovery and reconstruction project to achieve a resilient, stable energy system that our 3.2 million U.S. citizens living in Puerto Rico can depend on. The use of those federal funds will promote economic opportunity for our citizens, goals that we are confident are shared by FEMA, this Congress, and the rest of the federal government. Those are my words. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Colon. We'll now begin with questions. I'll recognize each member for 5 minutes of questions, and I'll start by asking questions first myself. I've heard a lot of references to inflation and the impact of inflation on getting equipment, on the supply chain, on the cost today. But I haven't heard so much about the pandemic. I think we need to acknowledge, I think, Mr. Curry, you said, who could have anticipated this level of inflation? Who could have anticipated the pandemic? We need to acknowledge that the pandemic has contributed to the inflation, and also having to manage 2 disasters at the same time, one in healthcare and one infrastructure, certainly caused the problem. So when you talk about what's contributed maybe to the length of time or the inability to get this done more, well, expeditiously, I guess, let's be sure we keep that in mind and don't just blame it on inflation. The purpose of the hearing is to really come with something substantive that Congress can do to make the situation better. And some of you have mentioned things. Ms. Williams, I think you said that you were concerned about the waiver of the local match requirement in areas where the devastation is so great and you don't have that underpinning of a good fiscal system. Anyway, that's one thing that we ought to look at. Another thing was you mentioned the lack of qualified personnel to oversee some of these projects. What could we do to help with that? Another thing was, in addition to Section 428 and the problems that causes because of the estimates maybe being overrun, is there anything that we can do to address the reimbursement-based assistance program for recipients or applicants with few financial resources? I would just ask you all to give us something specific that we can take back and look at legislation or regulation or something we can actually accomplish aside from what the agency is trying to do. And those things that I mentioned from your testimony. We'll start.
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. I think one of the first things that we've been looking at is the issues relative to capacity and the ability to have contractors and personnel to be able to do the work in the territory. FEMA commissioned a RAND study that said that if every able-bodied Virgin Islander was engaged in a recovery, we would need 5,000 more workers in order to get this done. One of the areas that we're looking at is our neighboring Caribbean islands, where we have resources there that may be able to come to the territory, but of course they would need legislation because they are countries of their own, but creating those opportunities for our neighboring Caribbean residents to come to the Virgin Islands to be able to assist with the recovery is an area that we believe can get some attention and provide some relief.
Thank you. From our perspective, I would like to highlight 3 particular items. It has been mentioned the low level of disbursements. And there is a reality, is that the federal regulation limits advances. We have to remind everyone that our recovery, once FEMA obligates funds, is based on reimbursement. So Puerto Rico, for example, we have a huge challenge in terms of accessing cash. Let's use as an example the municipalities. They have thousands of large projects that are based on reimbursement. If they don't have the cash, they cannot do the work. Therefore, they cannot come to Core 3 and ask for a reimbursement. Same thing with the public corporations. That has been a major issue because it's limited by regulation. And let me give you another important aspect of that. FEMA adopted 2 CFR in 2014, and that is the limitation. Before that, the regulation previously adopted allowed for 50% advancements after obligations. So imagine Puerto Rico being under bankruptcy, no cash, no access to capital, how we will be able to push forward permanent work projects if there is no cash, and then you have to rely on reimbursements. That's the reason why we came up with this creative program called Working Capital Advance. It has been instituted 2 months ago. It was first in place for municipalities, then expanded to the Power Authority, and then to the Water Authority, and soon be expanded to the Puerto Rico Department of Education and then public housing. That's the reason why you have seen a major increase in disbursements, because of the last 2 months, we've been advancing 25% of the obligated bonding by FEMA. The second ask, I will say, is that we mentioned the match, the global flexible match for public assistance. Although FEMA has granted us to apply the global match for the FAST projects, which is a major advancement, there is a restriction in the Stafford Act that has been interpreted as a limitation to apply global match for the whole recovery. Therefore, that could be an opportunity to go back to the Stafford Act and take a look at that. And number 3, the FAST implementation. I think the FAST was a novel, great idea to accelerate the obligation of funds, the availability of a budget, to have certainty. And it was approved, remember, in September 2020. This is for PREPA. For Department of Education, also obligated in September 2020, and for PRASA, the Water Authority, January 2021, and for public housing, January 2022. But the implementation of the FAST is one of the greatest lessons learned, because I think it was stated before that you have to go back individual project by project and resubmit that to FEMA. And FEMA has to make sure that it complies with the environmental historic preservation statutes at the federal level, and also look up opportunities for hazard mitigation measures. I have to say that the last 6 months, there's been a major improvement in the FAST implementation, but at the beginning, it was very, very challenging. I'll give you an idea. Last year, 0 projects approved for the energy reconstruction. Today, actually, we have 47, and we expect to have 100 before the end of the year. So that's major improvement, but in the beginning, it was very challenging. And the last comment I want to make is about capacity. I think that the gentleman from the GAO mentioned something very important. We recognize that when we entered Core 3 in 2021, January. That's why we dedicated a lot of resources and time for 2021, for the most part, and part of 2022, to increase capacity through the municipalities, the agencies, and the NGOs that are receiving money from FEMA for their repairs. I'll tell you this, in the beginning there was a risk, I will admit that, but 20 months later, the capacity has been increasing dramatically, in a good way. We feel very confident that now the municipalities can execute, and they have the full support of Core 3 because we provide the technical assistance to ensure that the procurement is done right, that the projects are executed, and that they comply with all the federal FEMA requirements. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Webster?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Mr. Curry, is there the work you've done for just reviewing the recovery efforts, are there any key provisions or lessons that have been learned that could be used in future responses and recovery in other disasters?
Yes, sir. First of all, the situation in Puerto Rico and USVI is so unique, just given their fiscal situation when the disasters hit, that other than some of the other territories in the Pacific, I'm not sure I can draw a parallel to other states, because one of the biggest challenge, and Mr. LeBoy just summarized it extremely well, is that unlike Florida or Nevada or Mississippi or any other state, you know, when there's a disaster, they have the ability to front the funds through loans or bonds or things like that, so they can do debris removal, start the repairs, and things like that, and then get reimbursement later. I think the biggest lesson learned for me with this is that, first of all, maybe not rolling out a brand new program that even FEMA itself or the federal government hasn't tested in a disaster like this. I think that was the biggest challenge. I think up front there were a lot of mismatched expectations, and I think both Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands were under the assumption that these 428 disbursements were going to be funds that would be provided once they got to some sort of agreement. That's not been the case. It's just a promise of funding, and as Mr. LeBoy said, even though you got to those agreements, there's a back and forth that's going to go on for many more years about individual projects. So, you know, I think the question has come up with, should we have just used that process to begin with instead of putting all that work up front to come to some of these upfront cost estimates? So that's one lesson learned.
Thank you very much. Director Williams, is the USVA Water Power Authority has received a significant amount of funding since 2017 hurricanes. However, it seems that they have planned a transition to solar energy despite outstanding obligations for the existing liquid propane gas system. What is the USVI doing to ensure existing obligations are met and that federal funding is being used to support rebuilding that will integrate into the existing power capabilities?
Thank you for that question. The Water and Power Authority has developed a transformational plan that includes the various sources of energy and trying to move our archaic dependency on fossil fuel into more renewables. They have utilized all of the federal funding sources that include the public assistance towards mitigation, as well as the hazard mitigation grant program, and also the CDBG funding program, recovery program, in order to transform. It's a combination of our developing composite poles, undergrounding, microgrid projects, battery energy projects, as well as the new generation projects that we've had that will transform the Water and Power Authority to more efficient fuels. So we have developed this overall plan that is working together with the Water and Power Authority. The first project that is really going to impact us is a new generation project of the power plant on the island of St. Thomas that we're expecting the batteries to come online in the first quarter of next year, allowing to impact not only our energy reliability in the Virgin Islands, but also our effectiveness in terms of keeping the power on and keeping the costs down. You may be aware the Virgin Islands has some of the highest energy costs in the territory, so the recovery funds have been chartered and directed towards making sure that we address not only reliability but cost in being able to load shift from to our battery energy solutions, as well as moving back and forth in terms of keeping the power on in the territory.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. Ms. Norton?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. LeBoy, although FEMA approved 95% of public assistance projects for Puerto Rico's recovery, after 5 years, much of this reconstruction has yet to be completed. And in many cases, it's not even yet begun. What are the challenges that hinder reconstruction efforts? And what is Corps doing to ensure timely progress on approved projects?
Thank you. When we started this role in 2021, in January, FEMA had obligated about $13.5 billion worth of permanent projects. And they continue to obligate permanent work funds until today. That number went from 13.5 to close to 22 billion in about 20 months. The challenge that we saw at that point was that there was already enough money obligated, and we wanted to get these projects going to get into construction. But the reality is that once the project is obligated, there are multiple steps that the municipality or the agency needs to take into account in order to see that project into construction. In the case of the FAST projects, PREPA, PRASA, and the Department of Education, they need to develop scopes of work. I think that there was this expectation in 2020 that when FEMA obligated the funds for PREPA and the Department of Education, the next day will be projects shoveled on the ground. That was never the case because that obligation never authorized construction. It was just a budget. Then PREPA and the Department of Education, later PRASA, have to go project by project, submit scopes of work to FEMA to go through the whole entire process evaluation and then get the approval so then they can go to construction. In the case of the municipalities, in the beginning we saw certain gaps for capacity. We addressed those gaps because we did a lot of training and we provided a lot of technical assistance and tools, and that started to see much progress on the municipalities' projects. But then again, the cash strap, the cash limitation. That's why we were able to implement the working capital advance, and for the last 2 months, it has been a total success because most of the funds that we have been able to disperse for permanent work, the majority have been disbursed for the last 2 months because of the working capital advance. There's also another challenge that we saw is that for the 428s, the fixed cost estimates, aside from the rising cost of construction and the inflation impact, the reality is that they provide an opportunity to do things differently, to actually build back better, to provide opportunities to submit improved projects or even alternate projects. The issue is that every time you want to do that, you have to go back to FEMA. So in every instance, the way you look at it, for the most part, you have to go back to FEMA to get an approval, whether you're versioning the project worksheet, whether you are changing the scope of work, whether you're improving the project, whether you are proposing an alternate project, or in the case of the FAST, every time that you develop a project, you have to submit a scope of work. In the case of the energy infrastructure, it's even more complicated because they need the approval of the independent energy regulator. So before even going to FEMA, after 2020, every project, even today, has to go to the Puerto Rico Energy Bureau, get their blessing, and after that, then develop the scope of works, submit it to FEMA, and then from FEMA, get the approval for construction. Now, the good news is that we have overcome basically almost all of those challenges since 2021. That's why we are very optimistic that there's really a paved way for road to recovery because of the number of projects that we have in construction, the projects that have been completed, and the projects we expect to be in construction in the years to come. So certainly there's still challenges. I will say that the rising cost is something that we need to monitor closely. Number one. Number two, the availability of skilled labor. It is very important. And then keep addressing the cash gap. Once we do all those three, I think that the future looks even more optimistic from our point of view. But I will say that the contrast has been really 180 degrees in the right direction. The support has been there from FEMA. I will say that we are very appreciative about the support, and that's why we're seeing this progress. But there's a lot of work remains to be done to continue this momentum.
I must say, Madam Chair, that this process needs to be streamlined, but my time has expired, and I yield back.
Thank you. I think you're exactly right. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to begin by something Mr. Lavoie just brought, on the suggestion about the staff right amendments. And to that end, I have HR 2017 before this committee, which includes an extension of the global match and other measures to ease these procedures. And I think this bill, after being in Virgin Islands, being in Puerto Rico, and managing these issues for the last 5 years, between FEMA and the government agencies as well, it's a way to put this money that has been approved by Congress in the right hands to work. So I encourage, if you can see it, and we're ready to work with you and this committee to try to ease the situation. So having said that, there's another issue regarding opportunities, and that's the working capital advance that will allow the government of Puerto Rico to use it for fast projects, specifically for schools and public housing on the island as well. So those are opportunities that if we can, of course that's a question to FEMA, that we are going to be submitted in writing to see if we can have that working capital advance and manage the reimbursement situation. We got a hospital that Congress allocated funding to Vieques that is not being built because of the lack of funds. And the island is still waiting for that. But I want to make my questions now to Luma. Last April, we were in a total blackout due to equipment malfunction. And since then, we have repeated interruptions on the island, sometimes involving hundreds of thousands of customers being without power, including me, right? Just to make that clear, I go to my house every weekend, and I'm one of the people that suffers this directly, and I don't have a generator. So this situation is not involving disasters, and that's my main concern. People in Puerto Rico always expecting those interruptions to happen during May to September, to November, due to the hurricane season. So you must have known the condition of the grid when you took over. And honestly, we don't see an improvement. I read your numbers and your briefing today to this committee, and actually you brought more information than ever before Luma has said to the public in Puerto Rico regarding the electric grid on the island. And you were hired actually to fix the problem. So my question to you will be, what is the estimated time for the grid to be up to date and ready to be considered up to current standards? And how much of that will rely on FEMA funding?
Congresswoman, that's an excellent question. I would answer that it has already improved. Since we took over, as I mentioned in my testimony, the design of the system was extremely poor. The foundational standards and the models that every utility around the country, they have it in order to scope the projects right, never existed. So we had to go out, and as I stated, scoping the project needs to be done per data, sound engineering, and science, and that's something that we have taken seriously.
And what's the estimated time to have the system up to standards?
Yes, so as of in the past 15 months, the system reliability has improved by 30%.
So sorry to interrupt you, I just got 1 minute. If I can know, what is going to be the specific time that Puerto Rico will have an updated system? Can you have that number?
This is a journey, Congresswoman. As
journey of
the
1 year, 2
importance
years,
of
5 years, 10 years?
The importance of FEMA projects is that it's going to help continuing and building on the progress that has been made. We, as I stated, the frequency of the outages have been improved by 30%, and with the projects in the pipeline.
You are an engineer, right?
I am. I have a PhD in electric power systems.
So you do plans for the future. My question here is, what is the timeline for having the power grid on the island fixed? That's the simple question. It is 1 year, 2 years, how many months? I know that you will rely on federal funding to make part of that progress. Do you have that timeline?
In the upcoming months and years, I can commit to you that the reliability of the system is going to improve.
You don't have that data that I'm asking?
what I can share with you is that the number of projects that currently is in the pipeline of FEMA, and every single one of them is going to improve the reliability of the system.
Okay, we don't have a timeline of when the system is going to be ready. And I just want that answer. How many personnel are in the field right now actually rebuilding the grid?
So we have 3,428 employees at Luma, and over 1,300 of them work in the field. But this is a team sport. The people in the field that they work from substation, restoration, in commissioning, transmission, and distribution, they get supported by dispatcher, by operation control center, and others, and they work very hard to restore the system.
So if if you got the personnel there, and right now we are in the hurricane season as we speak, my question will be how long it would take to you to use the mutual agreements Luma may have at this time. If there's a hurricane this weekend, how long it will take for you to bring people to the island to fix this?
There has been a lot done in terms of preparation for hurricane that I'm very happy to share it with you. I have been very closely monitoring what's been going on today, and as you might have heard, the tropical storm of Fiona with current maximum sustained wind of 50 miles per hour is...
Sorry, I know that I don't have enough time. My question is how the mutual assistance, the agreements that you have in place, when they are going to be arriving to the island, and with whom you got mutual assistance agreements right now?
Oh, we have a number of mutual agreement in place. We have established an agreement with Caribbean Electric Utility Service Corporation, Edison Electric Institute, and American Public Power Association. I have been in calls with every single one of them, making sure that there's a process in place, and if an issue happens, they are going to be providing support and assistance as part of the process.
What is the deployment time for them to reach the island?
So it depends on the forecast of the hurricane. Mm-hmm. We make calls to those mutual assistance and those agencies, and we inform them. I can tell you that today, our team in the morning, they have made those calls, and depending on how the storm or hurricane they approaches the island, we will inform them in collaboration with PREMBI and FEMA, ESF 12, Core 3, and number of other governmental agencies. In addition to that, there are 120 assets and units deployed and as part of the parents' commitment to the island, and it's ready for the line workers to be flown to the island and help with the restoration of the system.
Ma'am, I know my time has expired. I will submit a lot of questions for the record, and we should know why we should have Luma continue in charge of the grid. I'm really concerned about the outages in the island, even when there's no disaster on site. So I'm really concerned about that. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. I'm sure there'll be a number of questions submitted to the record, and we'll pass them on to you all. Appreciate the answers. I've allowed almost everybody to go over the 5 minutes because this information is so important, and rather than stopping you and coming back and doing a second round, I think it makes sense just to get the answers as we go. We'll now go to Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a question for Director Curry. A number of low-income households are forced to move from their communities in order to receive reconstruction aid due to the lack of mitigation projects in hazard areas. Even if flooding never occurred before, during, or after the hurricanes, too many are denied help to rebuild their homes, and no mitigation alternatives are given. My first question is this: in your opinion, has FEMA taken the needed steps to consistently integrate hazard mitigation into its recovery process? And has there been effective planning on the project together with other agencies such as HUD to effectively attend to the needs of the most vulnerable populations in Puerto Rico?
Quick answer is no. I don't think enough mitigation has been incorporated into the programs, and part of that's because of the way the programs were managed in the past. Most of these programs are designed to rebuild infrastructure the way it was before, not to build past current condition for the future. So I think they've gotten better over the last 5 years or so, but there's a long way to go. And then to answer your second question about low-income communities, I mean, one of the things we've reported on is that FEMA and HUD and others all have not done a very good job of considering the impact of these programs specifically on these communities and how the capacity of these communities impacts the recovery. And we've made several recommendations to try to get these agencies to think a little bit more about the impact and how these programs can be targeted to help, these communities, because every community is different. I think some communities have a huge level of capacity and a lot of resources to manage recovery and a lot of staff, and others don't. And that's not just the case in Puerto Rico and VI, but that's the case in certain parts of, the states as well.
Yeah, well, thank you for your candid answer, disappointing as it may be. My second question is a two-part. Has the GAO developed and published the disaster resilience framework to support analysis of federal opportunities to facilitate and promote resilience to natural disasters? Part one. And part two is, has it been applied to Puerto Rico, and with what conclusions?
Yes, sir. The answer to the first question is yes. We've issued a disaster resilience framework, and the idea behind that is that we think that resilience should be built in by decisions by policymakers at all levels throughout the process, including before, during, and after a disaster. These disasters are terrible, but they also damage a lot of infrastructure and provide an opportunity to rebuild that when, there would really be no other way you'd get this much funding at one time. So it's a tremendous opportunity. So yes, we have done that, sir. And so I'm sorry, your second question again?
The second part was, have these lessons been applied to Puerto Rico, and with what conclusions?
Well, I think Congress went a long way in doing this in the BBA and trying to build this into the recovery from the very beginning, recognizing that we weren't just going to be able to rebuild the way things were. We needed to rebuild past pre-existing condition. However, I just don't think, because of some of the complexity and the bureaucracy of these processes, it's been easy to incorporate resilience into the recovery thus far. So one of my biggest concerns is that to speed up recovery, we're going to bypass some of the resilience measures that we could build in, which are a lot more complicated to implement.
Thank you. And cognizant of my time, I want to switch gears and ask Executive Director Lavoy the following question regarding Vieques. The hospital is taking too long to build back. People are dying or having to abandon their communities due to the lack of specialized medical care in Vieques, and now even in Fajardo. And the provisional infirmary that's been put up in place is crassly insufficient. What are the main obstacles to advance the reconstruction of the hospital? And has the Core 3 identified other more effective ways to provide medical service to the people of Vieques while the hospital is built back completely? And if not, what's hindering you from doing so?
Thank you, Congressman Garcia. That's an excellent question. The first thing is that FEMA obligated the funds for the Vieques Hospital early January 2020. And sadly, the municipal leadership at the time probably had some challenges of how to move forward with the processes that need to be in place after the funds are obligated. The good news is that when Governor Pierluisi took office in January 2021, about the same time that I also entered Core 3, it was clear that the hospital was going to be a top priority. So we devised a strategy to do the conceptual design for the hospital, present it to FEMA, get the approval for FEMA, and from there, secure also funding. At that point, the obligation was about $39 million for federal share. After we were able to proceed with the adjustments of the insurance, it was actually increased to $43 million. We worked together with a state agency that dedicates its efforts on infrastructure projects, and together, the good news is that the old facility was demolished, finally, Actually, it was demolished about a month or 2 months ago. And now the design build or the request for proposals to finish the design for the new hospital and also to construct the new hospital was already published, and we're receiving the different proposals from the contractors. So it will be awarded according to the federal procurement that applies to this, and then secure the final permitting, and then begin construction. It is right now running on schedule, and it is expected that it finally will begin construction probably before at the end of December this year, maybe, but most likely will be early January 2023. And is going to be built in phases, and the last phase should be operational before the end of 2024. The obstacle, I will say that something related to Mr. Curry. I think that once the funds were obligated to the municipality of Vieques, I think that there was a gap in terms of execution, the capacity to execute on the municipal side. Once it changed administration, the new mayor was able to work together with Core 3, work together with the Purlisi administration, and things have been turned around positively. Now it's going to be a reality. It's going to start construction very soon, and we hope that by 2024, the people of Vieques will have what has been deserved, which is, access to health care. If I may, Chairman Titus, one question that Congresswoman Gonzalez mentioned about the plans for the grid. For the record, Luma and Prepa has to submit to FEMA Core 3 every quarter 90-day plans for the projects, and they also submitted a 5-year plan to FEMA and Core 3. So there is a 5-year plan for projects associated with the reconstruction of the grid.
And Mr. Lavoy, with the services until the hospital is built and operational?
That is something that has been delegated to the Department of Health. It is a top priority, and they have right now a plan, and they executed a plan that while the hospital is being built, and hopefully before 2024 it is going to be operational, in parallel, the Department of Health has to secure the services for healthcare in the municipality of Vieques, and also Culebra, because Culebra also benefits from the services. So it has been appointed to the Department of Health to ensure that it happens.
Madam Chair, thank you for your indulgence. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. Well, thank you to our witnesses. We've heard that you just can't build back to the way it was. It makes no sense. With climate change, there is not going to be a fewer number of hurricanes, or we can expect there may be more. So to build back to the old standards just won't do. We've got to build back better and take that mitigation into consideration. Also, we heard a lot about the renewable energy, moving to cleaner energy as part of this administration's emphasis. Another part of the administration's agenda is an across-government emphasis on justice. And that can be economic justice, can be environmental justice, can be social justice. So as we look at building back, we need to keep that always in the forefront to be sure that it's built back with consideration of environmental justice, so some areas don't benefit and others are left behind. Well, we thank you very much. This has been very interesting and something that we needed to do. Thank you, Ms. Gonzalez-Colon, for helping us with this. I'd like to ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to some of the questions that will be submitted in writing. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by the members or by the witnesses that you'd like to have included in the record. Without objection, so ordered, and the subcommittee stands adjourned.